Hey, what's up you guys? Welcome back to my channel. I have some really exciting news for you guys. Today, we're going to start a respiratory lecture series. In this series, we're going to talk about the anatomy, physiology, pathophysiology of the respiratory system. We're also, of course, going to talk about respiratory system diseases and disorders. We're going to get to talk about ABGs, ventilators, BiPAPs, and the settings on each of those. My goal is to publish at least one video each week, so there'll be plenty of content coming your way. Today's video is going to be a brief overview of the respiratory system. We're going to talk about the divisions of the respiratory system, the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract, and we'll talk about the parts included in each of those divisions. We'll talk about the difference between compliance and elastance, what alters airway resistance, and so much more. So without further ado, grab your cup of coffee or a margarita, whatever, I'm not telling, and let's get started. So the purpose of the respiratory system is to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the blood. Let's start talking about the upper respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract, you can see I've labeled here in this beautiful illustration that I've drawn all by myself. But the upper respiratory system consists of the mouth, the nose, the pharynx or the throat, the epiglottis, the larynx or the voice box, and the trachea or the windpipe. The nose is divided into two nares by a nasal septum in the middle. In the nose, there are these things called turbinates, which warm and moisten air as it passes into the nose. The nose also contains the olfactory nerve ending and therefore is responsible for smell. The nose also filters out small particles that are in the air, like pollen, dust, or allergens that would otherwise irritate our respiratory tract. Now, the purpose of the mouth in the respiratory system is just to allow the passage of air. You know how some people say that the eyes are the windows to the soul? Well, the mouth and the nose are the windows to the lung, except the mouth and the nose are open, so maybe the mouth and the nose are doors to the lungs. I don't know. You get the analogy, right? So air comes in your mouth and your nose, and it passes through your pharynx or your throat, past your epiglottis, into your larynx. Now the epiglottis is this projection that's right behind the tongue, and its goal is to cover the airway during swallowing. That way we don't aspirate or get food into our lungs. The larynx contains the vocal cords. As air passes past the vocal cords, sound is produced. And the trachea is just a windpipe. It just allows the passage of air from the upper respiratory tract into the lower respiratory tract. So the lower respiratory tract, you can see I've labeled here again in this beautiful illustration. The lower respiratory tract consists of the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli. So if you follow my picture down, you will see that the trachea branches into the left and the right primary bronchi at a point called the carina. Now the carina is very highly sensitive, and if you touch it during suctioning, the patient will cough. The right lung has 3 lobes, but the left lung only has 2 lobes. Now I don't know if I drew it out well enough in this picture, but the right primary bronchus is actually wider and straighter than the left primary bronchus, which means that if we get food into our airway, it's more likely to go into the right lung. And I think that that makes sense, right? Because imagine, if you get food into the trachea and food is coming down the trachea, it's more likely to go into the right lung if the right tube is straighter and wider than the left tube. Now the bronchi keep dividing into smaller bronchi, which eventually keep dividing until we get bronchioles. Now bronchioles keep dividing until we get to respiratory bronchioles. Now the difference between bronchi and bronchioles are that bronchioles have smooth muscle surrounding them, and this smooth muscle is responsible for what we call bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation. Bronchoconstriction occurs when the smooth muscle in the bronchioles contract. The smooth muscle contracts and it makes the bronchioles smaller or more constricted. So bronchoconstriction is a smaller tube. Bronchodilation, however, occurs when the smooth muscle relaxes. Bronchodilation results in a wider tube. The diameter of the bronchioles can be affected by medications that we give or in illnesses, and we'll talk about those in the following lessons. Now, the alveoli are the most important part of the respiratory system. They are the site where oxygen and carbon dioxide get exchanged. The alveoli have two types of cells. They have type 1 cells and they have type 2 cells. Now, really quick, in this picture, the alveoli are those things that look like cauliflower or grapes. Type 1 cells are responsible for gas exchange, and type 2 cells create surfactant. What is surfactant? Surfactant is a product that decreases surface tension, so the alveoli can expand more easily. Surfactant also decreases the amount of pressure needed to inflate the alveoli. So the alveoli are actually very unstable, and they're so unstable that when there's not a lot of air in them, meaning when we're at the maximum point of exhalation, the alveoli would collapse on their own. But the surfactant actually helps keep them open. Just a fun fact, when we take a deep breath, also known as a sigh, it actually helps promote surfactant secretion. So as you can see, I've written in red the two primary jobs of the surfactant. Surfactant decreases the work of breathing, and then it also helps prevent the alveoli from collapsing. When alveoli collapse, we call this atelectasis. Now I'm going to give you two examples of atelectasis. The first example would be a post-operative patient. So think about it. A patient gets out of surgery, they're under anesthesia. They're not breathing a lot, probably because it hurts from whatever surgery they've had. And the anesthesia actually makes them breathe slower and more shallow, so they hypoventilate. This decreases the amount of surfactant secretion and makes it increasingly likely for them to get atelectasis or a collapsed lung. Why? Because if they're not breathing deeply, they're not secreting surfactant. If they're not secreting surfactant, then they're not keeping their alveoli open, and if they're not keeping their alveoli open, we call this a collapsed lung or atelectasis. The second example would be a patient with acute respiratory distress syndrome, also known as ARDS. So in ARDS, there is widespread atelectasis, and this is partially due to the fact that there is a decrease in surfactant release. All right, let's talk about the difference between compliance and elastance. So compliance is how easily something can stretch, but elastance is how easily something goes back to normal after it has been stretched. Adequate respiration depends on normal amounts of compliance and elastance. To help you guys understand this, I'm going to give you the example that my physiology teacher gave us when I was in that class. So let's talk about a pair of gym shorts. Let's think about a pair of gym shorts. Let me go grab a pair of gym shorts just so I can show you. All right, gym shorts. Here we go. So compliance. Compliance is how easily something stretches, and elastance is how easily it goes back to normal after it has been stretched. I just said that, right? Okay, so let's take me for example. Say somebody who's much bigger than me tries on my gym shorts. My gym shorts are compliant, so they will stretch to fit over that person that is bigger than me. However, after that person wears them probably for a week straight, my gym shorts will no longer have elastance. They will no longer go back to the normal shape after they have fit around that person, meaning they won't fit on me anymore because they won't go back to normal. They won't have the same diameter that they once had because they have been overstretched. So my gym shorts might have compliance, but they won't have elastance anymore. When initially my gym shorts had both compliance and they had elastance. So why do we care about this anyways, right? So some diseases have low compliance and others have low elastance. Low compliance diseases are termed restrictive lung diseases, and these are called restrictive, right? Because the lung is being restricted. It cannot expand. So an example of a restrictive lung disease would be fibrotic lung disease. In fibrotic lung disease, there is chronic inflammation due to the inhalation of fine particles, due to the inhalation of coal, asbestos, things like that. Those fine particles end up damaging the lung. That leads to inflammation and scarring of the lung, and then the lung is not able to expand anymore. It is not as compliant. Decreased elastance would be something like emphysema, where the patient air traps and they cannot deflate their lung or exhale fully. So let's move on to the structure of the respiratory system. So We talk about the thoracic cage when we talk about the respiratory system, and the thoracic cage is made up of 24 ribs and a sternum that protect the heart and the lungs from injury. Attaching to those ribs are the muscles, the intercostal muscles and things like that, that help lift the rib cage when we breathe. The lungs are surrounded by pleurae, and I'll put that picture up real quick, that way you guys can see where I've drawn the pleura. Now the pleura are a double membrane that surround the lungs. Inside the pleura, there is something called an intrapleural space, intra meaning inside. In that space, there is 20 to 25 milliliters of fluid. Now the fluid that is in the pleural space has a couple jobs in and of itself. The first job of the pleural fluid is to provide lubrication so that the pleural membranes slide easily over each other during respiration. Think about if I put lotion in between my fingers. My fingers would slide more easily over each other when I tried to move them. The second job of the pleural fluid is to increase cohesion between the pleural layers, and therefore make it easier for the pleurae and therefore the lungs to expand during inhalation. So think about it. If the outer pleura goes during inhalation, but not the inner pleura, then the lung doesn't move and it just stays there. But if the two layers are just kind of glued together, then the outer layer goes and it pulls the inner layer, which helps pull the lung, and the lung expands during inhalation. Now I kind of alluded to it earlier, but the pleurae consist of an outer membrane and an inner membrane. The outer pleura is called the parietal pleura, and the inner pleura is called the visceral pleura. The parietal pleura has pain fibers in it. Inflammation of the parietal pleura causes pain during inhalation. The visceral pleura does not have any pain fibers in it. Now the lymph system is connected to the pleural space. The lymph system drains excess pleural fluid from the pleural space. If there's too much fluid in the pleural space, we call this a pleural effusion. So if the lymph circulation is supposed to take away the excess pleural fluid, but there's too much fluid, there's a mismatch somewhere. Either there's more fluid going in than the lymph system can drain out, or there's an obstruction of the lymph circulation. Now, the lymph circulation can get obstructed at that area if there's a tumor or a mass there, and there can be too much fluid for the lymph system to drain in a condition like heart failure, where there's too much edema everywhere and we third space that fluid, and then the fluid gets into the pleura, and then there's too much fluid for the lymph system to drain out. If the pleural fluid is purulent or has pus in it, we call this empyema. Now let's talk about the muscles of respiration. So there are primary respiratory muscles and accessory respiratory muscles. The primary respiratory muscle is the diaphragm. The accessory muscles are things like the intercostals, those muscles in between the ribs, and the scalenes and the sternocleidomastoids. When you're at rest, the diaphragm is the primary muscle that's working. However, anytime you have an increased work of breathing, like when you're exercising or you have an illness that makes you breathe harder, you're using your accessory muscles more than you normally would. Now, inhalation is an active process, meaning that the muscles contract when you inhale, but expiration is a passive process, meaning that the muscles relax when you exhale. So let's talk about the process of inhalation. So when you inhale, your diaphragm contracts and lowers, your intercostals, your scalenes, and your sternocleidomastoids can contract. They lift up your ribs and your thoracic cage. This creates a negative pressure in your lungs. Air flows from high pressure in the atmosphere down its pressure gradient to low pressure in your lungs and fills your lungs with air. And then when you exhale, the reverse is true. Your diaphragm is like this, it's flat. The muscles relax, it goes into a cone shape. The intercostals relax, the rib cage falls. Now there is higher pressure in the thoracic area, and the increased intrathoracic pressure causes air to be pushed out of your lungs and go down its pressure gradient from your lungs into the atmosphere. note here, the diaphragm is innervated by something called the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve inserts into the neck vertebrae at C3 through C5. So any injury to this area can cause somebody's diaphragm not to work, and therefore they must be put on a permanent ventilator. Now moving on, we're going to talk about airway resistance and airway diameter. So I wrote everybody's favorite formula up here, right? Resistance equals length times viscosity divided by radius. From this formula, you can tell that length and viscosity are directly related to resistance, but radius is indirectly related. Now, what does this mean? Does direct relation mean that one is the mother and one is the child? Not exactly. Direct relation means that when one variable increases, the other also increases. But indirect relation means that when one variable increases, the other decreases. So the more length a tube has, or the longer it is, the more resistance the tube has. The more viscous something is in the tube, or the thicker, more viscous, we mean thicker, or the thicker something is in the tube, the more resistance is exerted on the tube. But the smaller the tube is, the less radius it has, the more the resistance is on the tube. So here we go with another example. This time, let's talk about a water hose. So if I have a really long water hose as opposed to a really short water hose, my longer water hose will have more resistance. Now say I could turn on my faucet, and instead of water coming out, there would come out honey. Honey is thicker or more viscous than water, so it exerts a higher resistance on the hose. One hose has honey in it, one has water. One hose has more resistance, one hose has less resistance. Now say I have a tube that's this big, and then say I have a tube that's this big. The smaller tube will have more resistance, but the bigger tube will have less resistance. So how does this relate to the lungs? Well, in the lungs, the length always stays the same. Viscosity can change a little bit, and radius is the thing that changes the most. So how does viscosity change? Well, air can actually get thicker depending on the amount of water particles in it or how humid it is outside, which is sometimes why it's harder for you to breathe when it's more humid. So if you live in Houston, Texas, it's probably a little harder for you to breathe than if you live in Idaho or a dry climate. The viscosity of air actually also decreases with altitude. So the higher you go, the thinner the air is. Now let's talk about radius really quick. The larynx, the trachea, and the bronchi do not change in diameter. They don't change in diameter because they don't have smooth muscle that controls them. What does have smooth muscle that controls it though? The bronchioles, right? We talked about that earlier. So when smooth muscle contracts in a bronchiole, that is called bronchoconstriction, and it decreases the diameter and it decreases the radius of a tube. When the smooth muscle relaxes though, that increases the diameter and it increases the radius of the tube, and we call that bronchodilation. And bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation therefore affect the resistance of air getting into our lungs. The last thing we need to talk about is what can cause the bronchioles to change in size. Hormones can cause the bronchioles to change in size, the nervous system can cause the bronchioles to change in size, and then these things called paracrines, like carbon dioxide and histamine, can cause the bronchioles to change in size as well. When you have too much carbon dioxide in your body, this causes bronchodilation because your body knows that it needs to exhale the carbon dioxide. Histamine is a paracrine too. However, histamine causes bronchoconstrictions, and histamine is released in allergic reactions. If you have an allergic reaction, then you're going to have bronchoconstriction, which means that you're going to have a harder time breathing. Obviously, the worse the allergic reaction, the more histamine is released, which means the more bronchoconstriction, which means the harder the time you're going to have to breathe. Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the first lesson in our respiratory series, and I hope you're still awake and chose to go with a cup of coffee instead of a margarita. If you did go with a margarita, that's fine. I don't care. You can rewatch this video later to pick up anything you may have missed. If this video was helpful, then give it a big thumbs up. Subscribe for more content, and I'll see you guys next week.